This week on ICN, the stories you should have heard, but didn't. Will scarcity of food be the story of 2009? The bond market calls the Fed's bluff. Guess which country has gone relatively untouched by the banking crisis? The UN wants to tell you how to raise your children. Juries show the court who's the boss. Those stories and more next on Informed Citizen News. Hello and welcome to ICN, Informed Citizen News, February 15th, 2009. Our lead story is the developing global crisis in food production. Countries that make up 2/3 of the world's agricultural output are experiencing drought conditions. Whether you watch the news reports in China, Australia, Africa, South America, or the US, the scene will be the same: misery, ruined crops, and dying cattle. The world is heading for a drop in agricultural production of 20 to 40%, depending upon the severity and length of the current global droughts. Food-producing nations are imposing food export restrictions. Food prices will soar, and in poor countries with food deficits, millions will starve. The droughts plaguing the world's biggest agricultural regions should end the debate about deflation in 2009. In fact, agricultural commodities need to head higher and soon to prevent even greater food shortages and famine. The price of wheat, corn, soybeans, etc. must rise to a level which encourages the planting of every available acre with the best possible fertilizers. Otherwise, if food prices stay at their current levels, production will continue to fall, sentencing millions more to starvation. Moving on to the economy. This week, the UK Telegraph printed an article titled, "Bond Markets Call Fed's Bluff as Global Economy Falls Apart." The bond markets are especially complicated. With terminology like yield, term, and maturity, bonds can be hard to understand. When the UK Telegraph says the bond market calls the Fed's bluff, they're referring to the US Federal Reserve's promise to keep interest rates down. This is important because US government debt is like an adjustable rate mortgage. Because our country borrows new money to pay off old debts, we are subject to available interest rates in the market. Over the last 30 days, the 10-year US Treasury bond interest rate has gone from 2 to 3%. This may not sound like a lot, but that increase can translate to tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars in increased interest payments for Americans. Increasing interest rates in a heavily debt-laden country usually leads to the end of the party. The last nail in the coffin for Argentina, Zimbabwe, Russia, and Iceland was their inability to borrow money at low interest rates from other countries. At the rate the US is borrowing money, it will only take a few more years to realize the same fate: a default on its national debt payments. If you haven't noticed, it's been awfully quiet north of the American border when it relates to the banking crisis. It turns out that Canada was not as reckless as the rest of the world. Canada has yet to have a bank failure. The World Economic Forum ranked our neighbors to the north as the healthiest banking system in the world. By comparison, the US was 40th and Great Britain was 44th on the global list. While US banks were allowed to leverage themselves up to 26 to 1, Canadian banks were limited to 18 to 1. European banks can be leveraged by as much as an unseemly 61 to 1. While home prices were down 25% in the US, Canada has only seen a 12% decline. Why? Canada does not have non-recourse home loans like America. Americans can just walk away from home mortgages, where Canadians cannot. With some common sense, Canadian banks are holding their own so far in this crisis. Let's see how long Canada can last living next door to a reckless neighbor. What do you trust the United Nations to manage? International disputes like Rwanda or Sudan? Iraqi oil for food program? Has the UN managed anything well? They now want to manage our children. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, also referred to as CRC, takes child protective services to a global scale. The UN wants to have a say on your child's religion, discipline, and schooling. While the treaty states that parents or legal guardians have primary responsibility for the upbringing and development of the child, the government will ultimately determine whether parents' decisions are in the children's best interest. The treaty has been ratified by all but two of the member nations. The United States and Somalia have not formally adopted the convention. There are common sense provisions in the treaty, like prohibitions on child labor and prostitution. But the UN crosses the line when it believes that either it or the state have authority over the parent-child relationship. It seems like every day Orwell's vision of the supreme state becomes more of a reality. Most people think the judge is the power center of the courtroom as the final interpreter of the law. In reality, the jury is the most powerful element in a courtroom. Imagine a criminal case where the evidence is overwhelming, the prosecution goes off without a hitch, and the defense is minimal. The jury breaks from the evidence and finds the defendant not guilty. This is called jury nullification. It doesn't happen often, but juries do exercise their discretion on occasion. This week, a man was acquitted in Illinois of possession with intent to distribute marijuana. The jury decided that the law, which called for a mandatory minimum sentence of 6 years in prison, was not justice. This jury exercised their right of jury nullification and found the man not guilty. Judges and prosecutors never tell you this, but when you serve on a jury, it's not just the defendant on trial. The law in question is on trial as well. If you don't like the law and think applying it in this particular case would be unjust, then you don't have to find the defendant guilty, even if the evidence clearly indicates guilt. Many cases can be cited that show the jury has an unreviewable and irreversible power to acquit in disregard of the instructions on the law given by the trial judge. Fugitive slave cases are some of the numerous historical examples. The jury and its power to nullify unjust law, regardless of what a judge might tell you, is another check on the power of the state and is the last line of protection for Americans. The government operates based on the consent of the governed. We sometimes forget that. Now to our rapid-fire segment to quickly cover the remaining news of the week. As medical care costs increase faster than the government can raise benefits for seniors, the result, nursing home evictions. Discharge-related complaints of nursing homes has more than doubled in the past decade. As the economy continues in a downward spiral, news stories like this will sadly become more frequent. The IMF managing director said this week that the world is already in a depression and it will continue to get worse. He saw little hope of the stimulus having any great effect. Only a fix to the banking system will get economies back on track, but at this point, that seems years down the road. Local county governments are bracing for missed payments from their states, as they will get IOUs instead of money. County services like police, fire, and water will take the hit. About 400 people protested at the homes of bank CEOs in Connecticut this week. Their aim was to encourage targeted lenders to renegotiate loan terms on mortgages. Part of the stimulus bill includes incentives to digitize medical records. But the very things that make digital recording so appealing, easy access, sharing, and speed of transmission, make them vulnerable to everyone from snoopers to thieves to businesses that want to use your medical records for their profit. And let's not forget the ever-watchful government. And finally, U.S. intelligence agencies announced this week that the global economic crisis has become the biggest near-term U.S. security concern. It said a quarter of countries have already experienced at least low-level instability, such as government changes linked to the economy. There have been anti-government protests in Europe and the former Soviet Union, and growing economic strains in Africa and Latin America. The report went on to say that instability can loosen the fragile hold that many developing countries have on law and order, which can spill out in dangerous ways to the international community. Thanks for watching ICN, and join us again next week as we report the news critical to all Americans. From all of us at Informed Citizen News, have a great week.